Welcome to Insanity Fair. Today I'd like to talk about a French Muslim called Mohammed, who I got to know, and to explain to you his view of the world. There are plenty of French Muslims. France has the largest Muslim population in Europe, and they're mostly, in fact, Algerian, although Mohammed was Moroccan. There are also Tunisians and others, but they're mostly from the Maghreb, which is French North Africa, French-speaking North Africa. They used to be French colonies. There's a shop, a village shop, 5 kilometres from here, and I live in a small village in the French countryside, and every day I try and find some reason to go out somewhere, and so there was a period when I used to go down to this shop quite often, maybe 3-4 times a week, and it was taken over by a French Moroccan family, and a Moroccan family, I mean, but living in France, and they had come from the suburbs of Paris, and there was a couple, about 40 odd, and they were very nice. They were very interesting people, and the wife used to tell me how glad she was to have escaped, because she was in this environment where the suicide bombers come from. This highly criminalized area with very high unemployment, lots of drugs, and what the French call les petits voyous. I don't know what you'd say, little tearaways, little thugs. And the village shop was clearly not making very much money, so fairly soon they moved on, and they got a second shop in a larger village, and they concentrated on that. And so they had her nephew, I think it was, Mohammed, and they kind of parked him in this shop. And so I started to see him when I went down there. And he was bored out of his mind. He had to stay long hours in this shop. And he was a very verbal person. He if it had been me, I'd have had a book, But he was somebody who obviously didn't read, so he didn't have any books or magazines or anything, and he just stood there. And occasionally somebody would come in for some potatoes or a loaf of bread or a bottle of wine, and then they'd go away again, and nobody ever talked to him. So he was glad to have somebody to talk to when I went in there, and I became sort of interested, and we had this long conversation which evolved, because each time I went in I would pick up from where we'd left off. And he told me that the most important thing in his life was Islam, and that he had travelled widely in the Middle East, in the Arab world. He'd been to Saudi Arabia and various other countries in the Gulf, and travelled in North Africa. And also he had been through the French educational system, clearly one of the best educational systems in the world. And so he was actually a long way off the bottom of Arab society. But still, I was a little surprised when I started asking him about various things about the Arab world. For example, he'd never heard of Nasser. He'd never heard of Yasser Arafat. He had never heard of the difference between Sunni and Shia. When I started asking him about specific things about the Quran, he was mystified, because the Quran is something that in Arab education, in Muslim education, you learn by heart, but there's no analysis of what it says. And so that wasn't of any real interest to him. And yet he told me that he and his friends discussed Islam, that was the main thing that he was interested in, that was the main thing his friends were interested in, and also he told me that he was considered an authority on Islam by his friends, and that they would come to him with their problems. This was all very, very difficult to understand. And it was clearly difficult for him to talk to me, an infidel, about these issues. But because he had this need to talk, and because he had nobody else to talk to, eventually he explained to me what it was they talked about, and what he meant by Islam, and also why he considered himself to be an expert on it. What he was mainly concerned about was the problem of jinns, evil spirits. You know, Aladdin and his lamp, the genie, that's the same thing. It's actually, it's a Latin word that's been taken into Arabic. So it is actually genie, it's the genius, the spirit. But the Bedouin believe that the desert is full of spirits, of jinns, and also all disease, all bad luck. It's a very common belief throughout the world. It's not really fair to pick out the Arabs. You know, the Chinese are like this as well. Lots of people in India are very superstitious. And so if something goes wrong, then there must be some supernatural explanation for it. And so the framework of explanation was Islamic to a degree. So, for example, there's a prohibition in Islam on having pictures of living things, so that because it's said that only God can create, and so if a man tries to create something by painting a picture, then it is blasphemous, because he is acting as if he was God. And so that's why Arabic art has all of these beautiful geometric patterns and so on, as an alternative to simple representative art. So his explanation for that was that if you had a picture, then a jinn would hide in it. He would be able to hide in it. And also that a jinn would be able to hide in a mirror, and then it would be able to leap out at you and infest you. And that also anything that was dirty, any corner that had dirt in it, or a lavatory that wasn't cleaned properly, and anything that was halal, so anything like pork, a pig, any unclean animal, again with this Islamic reference, would come out. And so therefore, if somebody failed his driving test, or whose the sister was being disobedient, or whatever it was, then the solution was, first of all, to have a lengthy discussion of the jinns that were responsible, and then to recite some verses from the Quran, I suppose, some kind of slogans, some kind of incantations of Islamic prayers. I can't tell you exactly what those were, but the idea was that the solution to this was Islam. Now, as I say, this is somebody a very long way up from the bottom of Arab society, with years of compulsory education, with a whole second language, French, lots of international travel and experience, and a family background of articulate people who not only carried on business, but who you know, followed the world news on the internet, people who could have normal discussions as, you know, like anybody else in France. And yet this is the level of understanding. So when we discuss Islam and what people think, we tend to, you know, we think of it in terms of all of these beliefs that people allegedly have. And it's clearly not true. The mass of Muslims, the mass, and particularly of all of these young men who we see streaming into Europe, and you can see in any Muslim country hanging around, this is what's going on in their mind. It's not a question of sophisticated theology. It's a question of infantile superstitions.